Well, thank you everyone for being here. This is Dr. Kazique Prince. I am the interim executive director of the Central Texas Collective for Racial Equity. And I have my guests here today. We have Paul Saldaña, Chris Harris, council member Vanessa Fuentes, and Mimi Styles. I'm waiting on one more guest who hopefully will join us here later on, but we'll just let them join when they can. But with that said, to get us started, I want us to do some introductions. And so if you don't mind, council member, starting us off as introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yes, thank you. Well, first of all, thank you for having me. Good evening, everyone. Buenas noches. My name is Vanessa Fuentes, and I am the newly elected councilwoman for District 2. And I have the privilege of representing South and Southeast Austin. And yeah, I'm in month 3 of my term in office.
Oh, excellent. Welcome. It's good to have you. If you don't mind, Chris, can you go next?
Sure. Yeah. Hi. My name is Chris Harris. I am the Director of Criminal Justice Programs at Texas Appleseed, and really honored to be here tonight. Thank you so much for the invitation, Kazique.
Well, it's good to see you, Chris. It's been a long time. And Mimi, if you don't mind introducing yourself.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for inviting me to the conversation. My name is Mimi Styles. I get to be the president and the founder of this amazing research and public education organization called
My shit go right here. That's about it.
I just helped mute him. I'm sorry, Mimi. You want to finish up at the end?
Yeah, no problem. Welcome, Commissioner. Again, my name is Mimi Styles, and I'm the president and the founder of Measure. We're a research and public education organization that believes in people of color being the owners of their own data and subsequent narrative. So thanks so much again, Kazique, for opening up this space and this dialogue tonight.
Well, thank you. Paul, would you like to go next?
Sure. Hey, everybody. I'm Paul Saldaña. I'm a native Austinite, born and raised, a rare breed. We're on the endangered species list. Commissioner Travillion knows about this. I think we trumped the salamander several years ago. But my day job is I have a local public relations communications firm called Saldaña Public Relations. But these days, I'm spending a lot of time leading and working with the Austin Latino Coalition. Been involved in the COVID pandemic for about a year now, implementing a mitigation plan that's culturally relevant, that's bilingual to help both our Black and Brown communities. I'm also a recovering AIST board trustee. Gosh, in my spare time, I've got 4 boys and a grandson, so they keep me busy.
Man, I didn't know you had a grandson, Paul. Here you go, man. Well, Commissioner, last but not least, we're just doing introductions. Do you mind introducing yourself?
Sure. Thank you for inviting me. You guys make me feel very proud with all these young people on here, that are involved in community and working on important things. My name is Jeff Travillion. I have lived in Austin for 35 years. A proud graduate of Jackson State University, HBCU, and came here to go to the LBJ School of Public Affairs. And have been involved in community since I got here, whether working in church organizations. David Chapel, for example, was founded in my wife's great-grandfather's blacksmith shop in 1924. Worked on the Upward Bounds program in Houston, Tillotson. Served several years as NAACP president. Worked for the state at the comptroller's office for a number of years, at the city, Austin Energy and Small Minority Business Resources, and have been given the honor of serving as a county commissioner of Precinct 1 I just fulfilled 1 term and just started on another January 1st.
All right. Well, I have to say one of the things part of the reason why I reached out to each of you, because one, I have a different kinds of relationship with each of you. You've been stalwarts in the community and in your private or even elected role. And so I really wanted to bring you guys together. As you guys all know, today our subject is around political influence and involvement. And this is the last in a 6-part series in this conversation about path to racial equity. And the collective served, our part has been about continuing the conversation. We call it the Aftershow just to be funny, but they seem to like it, so we went with it. And so we wanted to continue this conversation And in preparation for our time today, I shared some questions with each of you. And I want to start really with the first one, which is, each of you, if you don't mind, just tell me what, in our audience, of course, what motivates you to be involved in your position to make political change? What really motivates you to do what you're doing? And Commissioner, if you don't mind going first.
Well, the first and most important thing is that I have seen change happen within my lifetime. I was born in Jackson, Mississippi in 1962. And 1962 was a year that Kennedy sent the troops to open up the University of Mississippi. And 63 was a year that he sent troops to the University of Alabama. And Johnson had to send the FBI down to Mississippi to see who killed the civil rights workers. When we work together, I believe that we can make change. But change is more than slogans, and change is more than giving lip service to one another. Change is actually defining what the problems are and taking material steps to address them. You know, I've heard so many people tell me that they're progressive and they're for things that have no policy foundation, no financial foundation, and no core group of supporters behind it. So don't tell me what you believe in. Show me what you're committed to and who's working with us to make the change we're looking for.
Oh, thank you, Commissioner. I appreciate that. It's really powerful. Council member, would you like to go next? What motivates you to create political change? And I know you're new to your office, but I know you've been involved in the community for quite a long time. What motivates you in your work?
Yeah, you know, part of the reason why I ran for public office in the first place was around the health disparities that we face. You know, myself as a Southeast Austinite, my life expectancy is at minimum 10 years less than Austinites who live west of 35. And what we've seen with this pandemic and even with the winter storm that we just went through is that when anytime a disaster strikes, it does not affect everyone in our community equally. And oftentimes it's our communities of color that bear the brunt of it. We're disproportionately burdened. And so part of what motivates me is to, you know, have the opportunity to tackle these disparities head on. And I know what better way to do this than through systemic change, through policymaking.
I appreciate you sharing that, because I think many of us know when a catastrophe hits, we know our communities oftentimes are the first ones hit, and it's the longest effect on us. And so we're looking at a long-term impact. So I appreciate you sharing that. Paul, would you mind going next? What motivates you to do this work from your role?
Well, probably my lived experience growing up here in Austin. As I mentioned, I'm a native Austinite, born and raised. I grew up in East Austin on Riverview Street, which used to abut the Holly Power Plant. And growing up, I could never understand why the neighborhood I lived in had the power plants, the chemical plants, all of those things. I grew up when we used to have those Austin Town Lake boat races near Fiesta Gardens. And then I was a product of desegregation. I went to 10 different schools before I graduated high school here in Austin. So depending on what side of the street you lived on, you went to a different school. I went to a different school every year after second grade. But I think probably I inherited something from my mom, and that is I was never one to conform. I was always unfiltered and willing to speak my mind. And so I think that probably just led me to be involved in the community. And over the years, I always try and make sure that whatever I'm doing, you know, I ask myself a question about how you're going to lead with courage, tenacity, and purpose. I always try and pose that question to our young people in particular. So I try to live by that. And I feel that, you know, if I'm not one to speak the truth, and who else is not, somebody may not be willing to do that. So I've just learned to do that. And fortunately, over the years, I had good mentors, one of them being former Mayor Gus Garcia, who I had the opportunity and privilege of working with him for many years. Our only minority mayor, our only Latino elected mayor in the history, nearly 200-year history of Austin, Texas. You know, we pride ourselves in being a very progressive liberal city, but the fact that we've only had one minority mayor in almost 200-year history of Austin, Texas, is a statement in itself. And so I think I use my lived experience to give my unsolicited advice to the mayor on the policy directions in which the city should go. And so I've continued to do that throughout these years.
I appreciate you, Paul, because what I hear you talking about is how your family really influenced you to speak your mind and then not to conform, as long as it wasn't applied to them. I need you to conform.
Exactly.
So
exactly.
I hear you. Well, Mimi, what motivates you in your role as part of Measure and other things that you do?
Yeah, thanks so much. So I always kind of like lead with honoring my father and my grandfather in the work that they did, and I make sure that people know. I mean, my back in the 60s and the 70s, my grandfather worked between the Black Panther Party and the police department in California to facilitate conversations. He held community discussions. He, started groups for youth and so forth. And my dad, in the same household, like my dad was a Black Panther as well as my uncle, Little Charles. And so, while my grandfather was doing this work as a quote unquote bridge, I mean, I almost can't even imagine the stuff that he went through, like, because this was during COINTELPRO and what he may have been, how he may have been used, right? And then what kind of conversations were happening just within his own home. Just always inspires me, I think, to continue to push forth and to be as progressive as I possibly can in the work that I do. But I can tell you that I also, there's that piece of like family heritage and trying to continue the work of my grandfather. But then there's also this piece of me that does this out of just out of like a darker place, right? It's out of kind of fear, and there's a little bit of anger there too. There's a little bit of just being completely fed up, and the idea of not having real trust in the system, so we need to measure it. And then myself, I mean, I have Black sons who I'm in constant worry about, to be very honest and real with you all right now. And I feel like if I can, in whatever way that I can, to protect my kids and make sure that they come home safely, then I'm going to do it. And hopefully that also does protect others and their children as well.
I feel you, Mimi. I worry about my babies, and they're not babies anymore, but I treat them like babies. And so you worry about them all the time, even when they're grown. So I appreciate you sharing that. Chris, I've known you for a few years now, maybe a little longer, and you've been very involved in the community and very aware of a lot of political issues. What motivates you in the work that you do?
Sure. Well, similarly to Mimi, I think, really it's, some of the experiences of my family, and in particular my grandfather. He was born on a sharecrop. And the military was really his only route out. And while that, allowed him to, have build a middle-class lifestyle, it was really hard on him and on my family. And, it took him too soon and never created the sort of wealth that really created a safety net for future generations of our family. And so having, known what he gave, what he experienced, what he gave to this country, and where my family still kind of ended up at the end of it. And then as I grew older, really being able to chart the connections between, the inequities that existed in his time that unfortunately still persist in so many areas. And really making those connections, it was a real awakening for me. And then, obviously I've come up in this age of real transparent, brutality, from the Gen 6 to Trayvon Martin and onward, that, really propelled me to stop everything I was doing and to get involved however I could.
I really appreciate you sharing that, Chris, because what you remind me of in Black psychology or Black thought, there's this idea of Mammyism or John Henryism, where we sacrifice literally our bodies for society, but not for our own communities, but for the white supremacy. And in the end, we die young. We have everything really tapped from us, and we have left that very much, if anything, to pass on to our future generations. And so I appreciate you sharing that. I want to transition to talk a little bit more and kind of move this conversation forward, because we are focusing on racial equity. And so from your perspective, because each of you are in a kind of playing a different role in the community and really focusing on the politics and engagement and involvement. And so what I think about is, from your perspective, what is the number one issue? And there might be more than one, but what is for you one of the critical issues around racial equity and this political space? Because there's so many different issues that are out there. What would you say is the number one issue that you feel like you're dealing with when it comes to racial justice, racial equity? And if we don't mind, I'm going to ask Mimi to get us started.
For me, I think it starts with, obviously it starts with structural and generations of institutionalized racism and the impacts of that system that has for generations and generations put people of color down at the bottom of the barrel, right? And so there's this constant climb. And so when you talk about like what is the one thing that is most prevalent, I personally feel like it has to do with wealth, right? Like you can think of the box of like health, wealth, criminal justice, you can think about education justice and so forth. To me, it's really about the lack of wealth and the strategic disenfranchisement of people of color, and the strategy that happened to us in this institution of enslavement that enabled us to even have that power. And so I think of like wealth is power. And so when we also think about that, we're talking about like there has never been a real dramatic shift of power. So you have then Black families with their median household incomes at about 40K in Austin, where you have white families that have almost double that amount. Where you have Latino families, our brown brothers and sisters, just a little bit over 40K, 44 or so K. And so this lack of wealth, generational wealth, completely, creates this system where we don't have access to healthcare. We don't have access to going to put our daughters or sons into the best schools possible, or living on the West Side so that our sons are, can have the same opportunities as our brothers and sisters on the other side of the map. We don't have the ability to go and have the healthcare needed in order to survive birth, right? And so when you talk about what needs to be addressed, I love the fact that Nook, Bird, and the Black Leaders Collective are doing work to address the racial wealth divide in Austin, because I feel like once you address that racial wealth divide anywhere, that's where the power begins to shift. And that's where we're going to see change.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that, and we may touch on that later on in our conversation. I know the Black Leadership Collective is involved, but I think there was something that was pushed by the Black Austin Coalition in collaboration with Mayor Pro Tem Harper Madison.
That's right. Thank you. Sorry about that. Yeah.
Oh, no, it's easy. You got all these acronyms thrown around, ABC soup. Paul, from your perspective, and I know each of us bring our own kind of visions and ideas. What for you is one of the number one issues politically that you're having to deal with?
Well, right now, we're in week 61 of the COVID pandemic, and one of the things that you've been hearing, the overarching themes, at least we've been hearing and experiencing, is we're unmasking the historic inequities that our Black and Brown communities have faced. And so I've been focusing a lot on this thing about a moral principle of distributive justice, right? That we have scarce resources. And so, the limited scarce resources really should be distributed to the communities that have bear the burden of this COVID pandemic, and then the winter storm recovery, all of those things. And that hasn't happened. I heard Commissioner Travillion earlier today, pushing our staff, city staff, to really focus on the Eastern Crescent, because if you think about everything that we've been subjected to, I mentioned where I grew up on the Eastern Crescent, the infrastructure is non-existent, whether it's pharmacies, hospitals, health clinics, grocery stores, all of those things. We're disproportionately impacted by this pandemic because of all of those things. And then on top of that, our Black and brown families were already struggling financially and everything else before we hit the pandemic, and then now with the winter recovery. So that's kind of really been my focus and emphasis over the course of the last year. I've learned more than I ever wanted to learn about a pandemic, and hopefully, we won't ever have to go through this again. But I worry about our young people who are going to continue to feel the impacts of what our community is experiencing now, 20, 25, 30 years down the road. We still don't know what the health consequences are. Already, we are hearing that our Black and brown communities' life expectancy, because we have been disproportionately impacted by COVID, that our life expectancy is already being cut another 3 to 5 years because we have been disproportionately impacted. So there's a lot of those things. So that, I guess, if there's one thing, it's the whole focus on distributive justice and making sure that our folks are getting the support and resources that they need as we're trying to recover from the pandemic and then the winter storm recovery.
One of the things I love about you, Paul, is that early on in this process, when the pandemic hit, you were one of the voices out there in the community, amongst others on this panel, who said we need to be doing something because we're going to be left behind. We are seeing the disparities. We know it. We knew it in our bones, and then we had the numbers to support it. But it's been a trial in many ways. So I appreciate your voice on that. Council member, I wanted to hear your thoughts. What's your kind of number one issue that you, from your perspective and your role, that relate to racial equity?
Yeah, I mean, racism as a public health crisis, right? Mayor Pro Tem Harper Madison recently passed a resolution stating it just so. And it's so important to state it and name it and then have conversations around it, because as we shared earlier, we're seeing it play out firsthand. As Paul was saying, there's a reason why we don't have a full service hospital east of 35. There's a reason why our food deserts are on the Eastern Crescent. And it stems back to how our community was intentionally segregated. And, and right now, dealing with the aftermath of the winter storm, we saw that we can't count on our government to step up and to care for us. We saw it at the state level, and we've seen it at the federal level, and we've seen it at the local level as well. There's a lot of accountability that we have to take on, especially me as now a new local leader, in making sure that these disasters don't ever happen again. And part of that is building community resilience. And in order to build community resilience, we really have to center our communities of color and address, as Mimi pointed out, the racial wealth divide. And I'm so thrilled that Council took action last week and passed a resolution calling for economic justice for our Black community. And I'm looking forward to holding our city staff accountable to come back with strategies and with measures so that we can move forward with creating a Black embassy, so that we can move forward and correcting the wrongs of our city's past. But yeah, I would say racism as a public health crisis is probably one of my top priorities. I serve on the Health and Human Services Committee, and that's an area that I hope to lend my voice to and to bring forward some policies and initiatives.
And thank you, Councilmember, for your being a co-sponsor for that resolution that came through last week. So thank you so much for your support, and I appreciate your thoughts on that, because it is a number one issue I think we're dealing with. Chris, if you don't mind, for your position, again, you've been involved in the community for quite a long time. What for you, from your position, is one of the number one issues around racial equity and some of the politics that are involved?
Sure. Well, I really, I can't argue with anything that's been said. And I think I actually just saw a presentation earlier from one of my colleagues at Texas Appleseed that mapped out the redlining in Houston from 1930 by the banks there, indicating where they would and would not lend money, overlaid with 2016 poverty rates and 2020 COVID impacts. And you will not be surprised to learn they were almost the same. Same parts of town that were redlined in the 1930s had the same issues with poverty and the same and issues with COVID. So, there's no question that that wealth is a big part of it. From my position, of course, I'm very focused on the issues with the criminal legal system. We have a situation now where finally, incarceration rates for Black folks are falling after reaching an all-time high in 2001. Even still, with the state of things today, 1 in 45 Black men is in prison. And that does not include the pretrial, people in local jails and incarcerated pretrial. And so, this continues to be a major barrier to the sort of wealth generation that, I think many of the folks on this panel have rightly stated is so key to overcoming the racial injustice we continue to face. And the way that the criminal legal system still, in many ways, both via the criminal statutes themselves and through the sort of policies, procedures, and practices of the different components of the legal system, continue to target communities of color and pull them into and then keep them in this system that one, obviously continues to drain folks and their families of money via fines, fees, and all the expenses that come along with being involved in the criminal legal system. And also by virtue of really having people's labor value be depressed in many cases for the remainder of their life due to the discrimination, the legal discrimination that you face by virtue of having a criminal history in our country. And so you throw on the fact that in most places, and you also are basically denied your access to citizenship by virtue of being involved in and being imprisoned at some point, meaning you cannot vote for at least for the period of your confinement, and in many places, including Texas, while you're on papers, and some places for the remainder of your life if you were actually imprisoned for a felony. And you've got a system that replicates many of the worst features still of slavery and Jim Crow. And so, criminal legal system continues to be a major focus for me, and I think continues to be a major barrier for racial justice.
Chris, thank you for really laying that out. And I know that when you think about criminal justice, and it's a complicated issue. It's nuanced. It's been something that's been kind of playing out for over 100 years, if not longer, as long as we've been in the country and longer. And what I hear you talking about is really trying to figure out within that system, how do we make the kind of changes that are necessary so we're not overburdened because of maybe a mistake we made, or kind of continuing the injustice that we find ourselves in. Anyone who's had any problem with the police and getting arrested for a warrant out for a ticket maybe you had knows the impact of that on a really light level, but we're talking about more serious things here. Commissioner, I want to get you in here. You're in a unique position as a county commissioner, and you've been around for some time. And so I guess I wanted to hear your insights about what do you feel like is one of the big issues around racial equity that you feel like is important to you from your perspective?
I think you just said I was old. Yeah. but
You're seasoned, brother.
When we start the discussion about equity, the first thing we've got to talk about is the fact that there was no intergenerational transfer of wealth in our communities. We've had several generations work without the ability to own a house, without the ability to leave land to their children, without the ability to provide the resources that would allow for a head-to-head competition. And then we've got to think about access as well. You think about the first African Americans being allowed to go to UT in 1956. You think about not only the school itself, but the network of people that you have access to because you go to an institution like that. Those things are denied. And you have to start asking yourself, what effective tools can we use to make sure that our kids have opportunity? My kids, my boys had an opportunity to go to school free or almost free because they played football. My daughter she was allowed to be admitted into schools, University of Texas, Texas A&M, because she was an outstanding student, but they did not give her much money to go to those schools. So you ask yourself the question, how do you create equity? Well, maybe we ought to be thinking about things like the GI Bill, for example. If I go to a school, I go there for 4 years, you pay for my schooling. Well, then maybe for 4 years, I have to go to a place, whether it's Houston or Dallas or El Paso or wherever, and serve 4 years. Practice, if I studied to be a teacher, 4 years in a school district that needs to see someone like me. Or if I'm going to be a nurse or a doctor, whatever amount of time I was given at that school, I should be able to work and serve my community there. I think the GI Bill is something that was one of the most effective desegregation tools and one of the most effective affirmative action tools, but we don't use that in our public education system for so many youth who are capable of achieving a great deal, but not given the access or the opportunity or the funds to do so. We find that 85% of our kids who don't go on to higher education don't go on because they don't have money.
And can I just add to that real quick?
Please do.
Also, just to build off what you're saying, Commissioner Travillion, we should have tuition-free public college. You know, if we had free college, we wouldn't have a whole entire generation burdened with debt right now. And so we should be thinking also along the lines of tuition-free public colleges.
I love these ideas. What you guys remind me of is, you know, even if you do go to college or even if you're in high school, when you try to go get an internship or some type of practicum, a lot of the times the expectation is that you're supposed to do this free, right? And if you come from certain means, you can do that because you have maybe your family or whatever resources to help you live working for free. And what I hear you talk about, Commissioner, and to a certain degree also Council Member, is we need to have resources that actually poured in so people can actually do this labor, that's what it is, labor, but not for free, but get paid for their time because they're actually making a contribution. And what I think about is when AmeriCorps started several years ago, that the biggest complaint was the cost. But the truth is, when you take that core mindset and apply it to what we do here in our own country, it's something for us to really look at. And making the cost of college inexpensive, if not free, I think is another really great idea. I appreciate that. Councilmember, I'm actually going to be starting with you on this next question. So thank you for helping me out and keeping the flow here. And my next question really is about getting people involved, you know. And I guess, you know, from your position as an elected official, I really want to kind of get your sense of some ideas or maybe even some examples of how activists or folks who want to be involved in politics, how can they better work together? Because one of the challenges I've experienced is that you find folks who are fighting against each other, but when you talk to them, they actually agree a lot. And so I'm wondering, how do you, in your kind of unique position to kind of be talking to different constituents who may be on the different side of the issue, how do you get folks together, whether it be from the community side or even within the city hall, getting people to work together? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think step one, we need to make it easier for folks to plug in. I mean, just even looking at the city council agenda, I mean, the everyday Austinite cannot read that agenda and you know, figuring out where to sign up and what item you're scheduled to testify on. I mean, just even trying to help the constituents navigate the process has been extrememe challenging. So I think the first thing we got to focus on is making it easier for folks to plug in. And the silver lining of this pandemic is now we've seen how we're able to get folks to testify over the phone, where they're able just to call in versus having to go downtown to go to City Hall. And so we need to make it easier for folks to plug in. But I think also just the relationship between activists and policymaking is one that I really value. And, you know, and I think that there's a part of it where activists let policymakers know what's going on in their community and what is the truth, what is the real story, and what is, what is the reality of the situation. And I really, I was invited to attend the vigil for Alex Gonzalez, who was involved, officer-involved police shooting, and I attended the vigil. And I remember one of the speakers said not one city council member had reached out to his family to offer condolences. And that is something that I was just kind of taken aback by. And it's something that always stay with me, knowing the role and the responsibilities that elected officials have. And it's something that is what I think the role of activists is, to hold elected officials accountable, and not just for what's public facing and out there for everyone to see, but like the true, like behind the scenes, keeping it real and keeping it based on humanity. What is the toll of the policies that we have in place? And so it's that connection that is essential to get things done and to keep policies moving forward.
I really appreciate you bringing up the technology issue, because I remember before COVID, it seemed like it was impossible to have city council meetings online and bring people in remotely. And all of a sudden, magically, we made it happen. And so I'm curious to how things will be after things settle down, how we might learn from this experience and use that as a way of, like you said, make the distance between people's ability to get involved, and the use of technology to reduce that. So I appreciate you bringing that up. Chris, if you don't mind going next, I wanted to hear from you about, from your position, what are some ways that we can get folks working together and collaborating more?
Yeah, sure. Well, I guess my general thought is that if you really are passionate about an issue, to look first to see who's already working on it, and see if there are people that are already engaged in these issues, and if you're aligned ideologically, and you can move with those group of folks to figure out how you can plug in there. Because what I was always taught is there's really two types of power: organized money and organized people. And so if you're trying to do something alone, then you're not really trying. And so you have to connect with others. Now, if you don't see anybody working on an issue that you agree with, that you can find a way to plug into, then that's when you organize and you try to start talking to your neighbors and your friends and see if they feel the same way that you do. Because once you're together, then you collectively might have the skills to decipher a city council agenda and check it out and find the issues that you need to get engaged in. Collectively, you might, have the ability to, raise some funds to help somebody out in the community. And collectively, you might, have the ability to put on an event, to spotlight an issue and actually get the media's attention about it. And so again, it's really about, first, I would say, trying to plug in with the groups that are already working on those things if you can. And then failing that, or where there's gaps, then trying to organize anew and seeing what you can do.
I really appreciate you, Chris, on that, because we have over, I forget how many hundreds of nonprofits here in Austin doing good work, but many times I'm asking myself, can't we get along and get together on this instead of starting something brand new? But it's Austin, it's part of who we are, but I really like your advice and attention to that. Commissioner, I was hoping to hear from you, what are some ways that we can get not just our activists and political folks, but just people in general working together more effectively?
Well, for me, I always try to follow my heart. My parents were teachers, and I observed teachers for most of my life. What they do during school, what they do after school to make sure that kids understand that they own the school. I try to focus on things that I am passionate about. I know that I can't focus on everything, but what I can do is try to make sure that when someone approaches the office with an idea that's important, I try to make sure that I help remove barriers for them. And then I try to make sure that I connect the dots, that identify other people who are working on those issues and they should be working with. The most important thing to recognize is if all of us were working together on one accord, there still wouldn't be enough of us to achieve the things that we need to work on. So what we need to understand is what the continuum is, where our skill sets are, what we work at well, and then invite others to labor in the vineyard as well. I try to focus on those things that are really important to me. I try to make sure that I identify people that are working on things, and when there's an opportunity to connect one with another, I try to do that.
And you just remind me how powerful we are when we are together on something. I don't know about y'all, but you know, when they do a psychological test, they always ask you to take them individually, see how smart you are. And what we found out in other countries, the idea of doing that all by yourself is just ridiculous. You pull in someone who knows about this or knows about that, and what you find out, there's not just an individual intelligence, there's a collective intelligence that's as, if not more powerful. And so I really appreciate you mentioning that. Mimi, I want to get you in here. What are some ways that we can get folks working together more effectively when they're tackling some big issues, particularly racial equity?
Yeah, I appreciate that question, and I want to just kind of challenge the question a little bit, just in the ways that I've experienced Austin, especially within the last year with this pandemic and social justice unrest and so forth. I believe that we have embarked on this beautiful ability to work together as organizers in collective action. I feel like I'm relatively new to Austin. I've been here for a little over 5 years, but I believe that, that what I have seen just within the time that I've been here has been incredible. I mean, we just saw, again, that resolution just be passed by, it was a collective of organizations that called in, people that called in, all seeking the same idea of justice for Black people. I feel like we all have had an opportunity to kind of show what we do well, and we all have this community appreciation of knowing, okay, well, Mimi and them, they do data stuff, and Chaz and them, they do some really amazing mobilization of communities. Chris is probably one of the best data activists this side of America. I mean, so like we all have these very clear ideas of the superpowers that lie within each organization, and we're understanding how to work with one another. And and the thing is that that's not new, right? I mean, people of color, we have always depended on one another, from that time back. I'm sure Paul's mom maybe sent him next door to go grab a cup of sugar when mom needed to make a cake, or Commissioner Travillion's family maybe have all met at the same church and had picnics together, and we all came together and brought food, and we did this all collectively. And so I feel like that we have embarked on this idea of what collective power looks like. I just feel that we also are sometimes set up to fail by the institution and through the impacts of structural racism, right? And so when you're pushing against a brick building, it's not always easy. And so we have to be very careful too, as organizers and leaders in communities of color, to understand that we do work together, and we work together powerfully. And when we do come together and understand each individual's core values and appreciate our individual's core values, then we can move mountains. And that is what I believe that we're seeing. But there has to be institutional change. There has to be, again, that dramatic shift of power from the institution in order for those efforts to really be seen.
I appreciate you saying that, because that is the truth. The truth is we've been working together for a really long time, and really have taken advantage of that power that we bring together when we're working on the same accord, really tapping into the God-given genius each of us are given to do this work. So appreciate you sharing that. Well, Paul, you're going to be our last person on this question before we move on to questions from the audience. And I want to remind people, if you have any questions you want to ask our panel, please feel free to enter those questions into the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. And Paul, I guess I wanted to hear from you. You've been involved with the community. You're connected legacy-wise. What are some ways that we keep people working together on big issues, particularly when it comes to racial justice?
Well, specifically for our Latino community, I remember a little over 25 years ago, small conversation like the one we're having today with a group of folks. And we basically started figuring out that, like today, we represent 40% of the population, but even back then and even now, the majority of Latinos in Austin are young folks. While we're 40% of the population, over 70% of Latinos in Austin are under the age of 19. Over 80% are under the age of 35. And so whether we're ready for it or not, and everybody else is ready for it or not, we will be continuing to play a very strong influence in the economic landscape and the policy direction in which our city is heading. We're also not monolithic as a community. People think that we're all Mexican-American, and that's not true. We have at least 25 subcultures of Latinos here in Austin. But within our Latino communities, we have a lot of challenges, and sometimes we become our very worst own enemy, in that when we see people in our community taking a leadership role or having success, we're sort of the first ones to tear them down. So our conversation a little over 25 years ago is we need to change that. And we need to really focus on self-determination and making sure that we're preparing the next generation of leaders. So how are we going to do that? So we started this group called Habla. Kazique, you come to our Habla, what we call Habla Platicas. We meet every month. Habla is an acronym that stands for Hispanic Advocates Business Leaders of Austin. But when we start these monthly conversations, now we're doing weekly virtually, we pose 3 rules. Everybody checks their egos at the door because everybody's on equal footing. You have to be committed to being an active listener, an active learner, and then you have to be committed to helping develop sustainable solutions on the short term and long term. Because the rest of the folks, especially those who are not of color outside our community looking in, are not going to wait for us. And so it's really incumbent upon us to really be involved in influencing the future of our community. So that's kind of what we've done. We do that again. I started off and prefaced my comments tonight about how are we going to lead with courage, tenacity, and purpose as individuals, but also as a community. A few years ago, I read a book by a guy named Stephen Phillips, who talked about brown is the new white. And he was talking about how the demographic revolution has created this new American majority, and that the majority of folks in America are Black and brown folks, right? But if you think about, the power has always been controlled by the white guys, right? And so, it's time that we changed and start shifting the power and resources to the communities that have historically been marginalized. So that's the challenge. I think all of us need to rise up, and I think we are doing that, and especially for our young people. I mentioned my boys, my grandsons, our young folks. So I think it's incumbent upon us to be responsible adults to help pave the way and support our young folks from our community to take on this leadership role. And they may make mistakes, but that's okay. That's part of the learning process. But I think one thing we all have in common as a Black and brown community is intuitively, historically, we have always had to fend for ourselves. And we've had to fend for ourselves during this COVID pandemic and during the winter storm recovery. So we can do that. We've proven that we can do that. And I'm proud of the working relationships that we've had during the pandemic with the Black Leaders Collective or Austin Latino Coalition, the Del Valley Community Coalition. We're rising to the occasion to support our communities because government has let us down.
Well, thank you, Paul, for that, because I think that's really, really powerful. I'm going to paraphrase one of the questions I received and kind of open up for everyone to answer this question. What do you feel like politically are, whether it be legislation or certain issues, whether it be on the local level, state level, are things that you think folks in the community need to be keeping their eye out for? And it may be something that's more immediate, maybe something more long-term, but it's on your radar. And you feel like the community needs to be aware of this, to maybe learn more about it. What would you say is some politically or some things that folks need to be attuned to? And Chris, I'm going to start with you, if you don't mind. Something that's just, you found that's on on the horizon that you need people to pay attention to?
Sure. Well, how much time we got? No, I'll try to keep it brief. Firstly, at the legislature, we're, through my work at Texas Appleseed and with a whole host of partners around the state, I want to highlight two of the coalitions that I'm in. One is around the passage of the George Floyd Act. This is really omnibus legislation designed to address a lot of sort of low-hanging fruit, in my opinion, as it relates to police reform, as well as to finally sort of address an issue that has come up in the ledge over and over since Sandra Bland was killed in 2015, which is limiting police arrest authority for non-jailable offenses, basically fine-only offenses. And so I think this is a really important piece of legislation that could use support. And I'm going to put some links into the chat here momentarily so folks can follow along with this. Another is a Clean Slate Coalition. So this is a coalition of organizations looking to expand eligibility to criminal record sealing and expunction, as well as to help automate the process for folks. So as I mentioned before, we have literally millions of Texans who are criminal justice involved. And for many of them, they face legal discrimination daily in housing and employment and education. Many who have not been involved in the criminal legal system for a long time. And so we want to make it to where more people are eligible to have their record cleared, and we want to make it much easier to have your record cleared. And so again, I'll drop some information in the chat, and we have actually a kickoff event for that coalition on Friday that I'll put an event in for. And then last but not least, I've of course been very engaged in issues around homelessness. And there are many propositions on the ballot in Austin on May 1st. Early voting starts April 19th. One I'm very focused on is Proposition B, which seeks to recriminalize homelessness. Over a third of the people experiencing homelessness in our community are Black, despite being roughly 8% of the city's population. This is undoubtedly a racial justice in addition to a criminal justice and a housing justice issue. And so we're encouraging everyone through my official role in there to vote no on Proposition B. So, and again, I'll drop some links in the chat for folks that are interested in getting engaged in those efforts.
Thank you, Chris. I appreciate those links, and we'll definitely share those. Council member, what should we be looking out for in the near or far future?
Yeah, I mean, right now, my attention certainly is around equity, around vaccine distribution, and ensuring that we're doing all that we can to get vaccines into our community's arms. So definitely keep an eye out for that. And, the President Biden has committed to having enough vaccine supply by the end of May, which is 11 weeks for us to really scale and ramp up our efforts and to meet the need of our efforts. So that would be my issue to give to everyone.
Cool. Thank you. Appreciate that, Councilmember. These are critical things that people are really concerned about. Paul, if you don't mind, what are some things that you're looking out towards and want to bring people's attention to?
Well, I'm gonna probably go back to my former days as a former AISD trustee. Dr. Stephanie Hawley is a good friend. She's our equity officer, and I think we need to continue to support her in the important work that she's doing. We've been talking for years about AISD doing an equity self-assessment, and I think we need to do that. I mean, fresh off of the very controversial school closures and consolidations, we already know what that decision was. The majority of Black and brown Title I schools were closed. And so moving forward, any decision that the school district makes has disproportionately negatively impacted our Black and brown communities, and we're the majority of the kids in AISD. So I think supporting Dr. Hawley and the important work that she's doing, she's calling for the equity self-assessment or equity assessment to take place, and that's a decision that's going to be coming up. I know she's in the process of putting together another committee to work in partnership with her so that AISD can push that forward. So I think people certainly need to keep that on the radar screen. And when Dr. Hawley asks for our support, we need to be there to support it.
Need to show up, right? Need to show up every time. Mimi, I wanted to hear from you. What should we be looking out for in the near or far future from your position?
Yeah, definitely. And I'm going to echo just again, supporting Dr. Holly and the work that the Equity Office is doing. Measure has taken a very strategic approach to the disruption of adultification bias and protecting Black girls, whether they are in schools or whether they are being criminalized outside on the streets. And so it's really important to, to support the work of the school district as they're seeking to disrupt the school to prison pipeline. But secondly, I'm also very laser focused right now on the selection of a new chief for Austin in the police department. And so I have been very open about this, in the idea that, let's make sure that we're taking a very equitable approach to the hiring of that. I am going to just put it out there, woman of color. We know that the data shows that when women are empowered to be police officers, that things go down that we're hoping to go down, like, use of force and so forth. And so just very much so hoping that the city does allow for a very, community supported measure in order to get that new person in that leadership position.
Thank you for bringing attention to that, because this is a great opportunity to move our community in a different direction. And you're right, there is a really strong research and evidence on when you bring women into law enforcement, it changes how the community perceives the police, but also their engagement with police. Commissioner, I leave you because I think you have as much knowledge as all of us put together when it comes to some of the things going on here in Austin. And I was hoping to have your wisdom to give us some guidance on things that we should be looking forward to in whether it be on the state, county, or other levels. And what do you have for us?
I think you just found a new way to call me old again.
I am creative.
but I'll say, I think what the pandemic has taught us and what working through this winter storm has taught us is that the most important thing that we can do as a community is expand access to Medicaid. It is important for us to make sure that we cover as many children and families as we possibly can. Another thing that I think we have to do is really focus on our after-school programs. When we pay 60% of our tax dollars for our public schools ought to be open until our parents get home. They should be open from 7 to 7. They should be a place where you get 3 meals, where you have tutors for homework, and where you do your extracurricular enrichment activities. It's important for us to make sure that we capture every dollar that we can. And then we start focusing on job training as well. We have been focusing on working with groups like Tesla to bring jobs back to this city that will be middle-class jobs, but they're semi-skilled jobs, meaning you don't need a college diploma to get them. And that we can train you for some of these jobs, even if you're incarcerated. It's important for us to address these issues. It's also important for us to look at the way that we practice criminal justice here, because I sit with Chris a lot, and I understand that it is important for us to change the way that we do business, to look where we're putting our dollars today, and if they're not serving us well, to reprogram them and make sure that they begin to. And hopefully, I don't think that we can do it with this legislature. It's important to get rid of qualified immunity. But in order to do that, we need to organize starting tonight, getting voters ready to send Greg Abbott home.
Man, I don't know about y'all on this panel, but I walk away today feeling empowered. I feel informed. I feel like justice is in all our wheelhouses today as we come together to really create the kind of change we're all looking for. I want to say thank you to each of you on this panel, Paul, Chris, council member, Mimi, and Commissioner. I just want to say my heartfelt thanks to each of you for being here today. This is the last in our series of the Aftershow, Pathway to Racial Equity. And we've recorded this, and so we will be making this available in the next couple of days online, so you can continue to watch this and share this with your friends and family. Again, thank you to the panel for your presence and your wisdom today. And just, again, thank you for everything that you guys are doing in the community to make a real difference, because as Mimi reminded us, we're already working together. We just need to be acknowledged and seen for what we're doing and given credit for the hard work that we're doing today. So thank you again. And I'll see y'all next time in those streets.